our fourth Network Cafe of the 2023-2024 Network Cafe Series. My name is Colleen Stewart. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the New Hampshire Food Alliance. And as I said, please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat, get to know where everyone's calling in from, what organizations they're with. That's how we build our network together, is by networking with each other. You'll find our agenda in the chat as well, so just take a look at that and kind of see what's in store for our presentation for today. And just to kind of ground everybody, especially if this is your first Network Cafe, I just want to share a little bit about the New Hampshire Food Alliance and our work, as well as just kind of what these Network Cafes are all about. So the New Hampshire Food Alliance is a statewide network that engages and connects people dedicated to growing a thriving, fair, and sustainable local food system here in the Granite State. We host these network cafes each month on the first Friday as a space for kind of conversation and learning together, as well as, covering various food system topics, and just really a place for all of you to connect with each other, albeit virtually, but connecting nonetheless. And we do all this work with network cafes and other things, many other things, as a community outreach program of the Sustainability Institute at UNH in Durham. And a couple things about our affiliation with UNH. We always like to share at the top of our meetings and things like this, our shared dedication with the university to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. We believe those four tenets are foundational to achieving our core educational mission and embracing the many characteristics of our community that make them unique. As part of the university's commitment to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, we believe it's important to continually acknowledge the hardships the Indigenous communities in our region have faced, as well as the positive impact they have made in our communities through the UNH Land, Water, and Life Acknowledgement, which I will read a little bit from now. As we all journey on the trail of life, we wish to acknowledge the spiritual and physical connection the Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples have maintained to Indakina, homeland, which the University of New Hampshire community is honored to steward today. We also acknowledge the hardships they continue to endure after the loss of unceded homelands and champion the university's responsibility to foster relationships and opportunities that strengthen the well-being of the Indigenous people who carry the traditions of their ancestors forward. Okay, one last bit before I pass it to Nicole. Please take a look at our agenda. Again, it's in the chat. Two things I want to point out on there are our desired outcomes for this Network Cafe, which will kind of, again, give you an idea of where we're headed with our presentation and our content for the day, but also our working agreements. Those are a little broader, and those will kind of give you a good idea of what we all expect of you during these Network Cafes and what you can expect from us. And it just, in the effort to make sure everybody's on the same page, we often point people towards that just to provide some grounding. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Nicole. She's going to introduce our speaker for the day, as well as give us a little bit of framing of what we'll talk about.
Thanks, Colleen. Nick, could you go to the next slide, or actually go forward 2, please? I'm Nicole Cardwell. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm the program director for the New Hampshire Food Alliance, and we're so excited to have you all here. It's really fun for me to see the introductions flow in the chat. We have farmers here today. We have representatives from regional planning commissions, from people as far away as Cincinnati that I've seen, trying to keep up with all the different organizations and individuals represented in this group of people here today so far. So we're here to talk about the New England food system and this report from the New England Feeding New England project called A Regional Approach to Food System Resilience. Nick, will you go forward one more slide for me? Thanks. So the New Hampshire Food Alliance is part of this partnership. The New England Food System Planners Partnership is a partnership of the 6 state food networks in the New England states in collaboration with Food Solutions New England. And we also now have a partnering state agency from each of the New England states. In New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Department of Ag Markets and Food is an official partner in the partnership. Over the last 3 years, the partnership pulled together with help of researchers like Nick Rockler, a report called The Regional Approach to Food System Resilience, as many of you know. And that report is predicated on the question of how much food, or what food are we eating in New England? What are we producing in New England? And then where do those two circles overlap? Where do they come together, and how might they come together more? And so the report is a lot of information. Can you go one more slide forward, please? It's a lot of information. It's 5 volumes of information, a lot of data. And so what we've done with this year's Network Café series is to break down that data and invite the lead researcher from each team to come and share a few of his or her key takeaways and be available to our network to answer questions and help make this information accessible for you all. Because that's the point of it. The point of it is to help us understand the New England food system better and use this information to do our work better, to fundraise more effectively, to plan more strategically. So we looked at the executive summary and overview in September. We looked at resilient eating patterns and what that means, the estimating production in November. And today we're looking at the economic impact of the New England food system. And we're so excited to have the lead researcher for that team here with us today, controlling my slides. Sorry, Nick. Next slide, please. We have Nick Rockler here with us. And Nick is an expert in regional economics. I have his bio right here. Forgive me, I'm gonna read it, Nick. He's an expert in regional economics, input-output economics, and public policy analysis. He's a doctor. Dr. Rockler has previously held positions as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, where he received his PhD, and as a senior economist at Data Resources, Inc., which is now called Global Insight, where he developed the first US metropolitan area forecasting model. He's the co-founder and CEO of Kavet, Rockler and Associates, which provides professional economic consulting services customized to clients' needs. And we've asked him here today to talk about the research team that he led. What were they looking at in their research? Who was part of that team? And what were some of his major takeaways? And then we'll have the second half of our time together to ask him questions. Nick, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much. Yep, thanks very much. I hope you all hear me okay. Thanks for sharing your lunchtime. It's a good time to talk about food and food systems. And I'm not sure I recognize the person who you were talking about, Nicole, when you mentioned when you gave my background, but that's okay. It sounded much better than I probably really am. But so I'm going to talk about how the economic impact analysis fits into the overall New England Feeding New England project and what it means specifically for New Hampshire. The framework behind all of this is to see what it would mean if we were able to move for New England to be able to provide 30% of its food needs, and also to see what would happen if there was a change in the diet that would follow a healthier and more sustainable pattern. So this is a forward-looking project and very much perspective. But so I'm going to just quickly, that was the goals of the research that we had in mind. I am the lead economist on this. I worked with Alan Kaler, who's at the Vermont
Sustainable Jobs Fund. Too many acronyms.
Thank you very much. And with Scott Sawyer, who's actually a researcher of many talents, but he was actually very helpful in helping me organize some of this research and present it. So, but I'm largely responsible for it and all of its defects. And so that's the research team. And we're going to talk about, we have prepared essentially a database that is slices of time for reasons that I'll explain very quickly and very shortly. And we have a database of various detailed output and employment characteristics of each state's food system. So So then we're going to go into some of the detail with New Hampshire's food system and comparing that to the region as a whole, and then what the implications of the resilient eating pattern and a higher level of regional production would mean for New Hampshire. So in talking about economics, it's a thrilling subject. I know everyone is anxious to get to all of the detail, but when we talk about economic impact, we're really we characterize it by fairly common measures of jobs or employment creation, income, state product or state gross regional product, and sales. And we stick to that convention. We have 28 different detailed categories that are classified into 3 major groupings: farm and fisheries, manufacturing, and services. And farm and fisheries, everyone knows what those are in terms of crops. Manufacturing is industry level production statistics, and services are the non-manufacturing and non-agricultural part. So that's, in this case, wholesaling, retailing, and food and beverage or restaurant activities. So when we look at economic impact, we look at the levels of activity and we look at growth rates. That's a fairly common approach. And we also look to see what the strength of linkages are between the food system or those individual categories and the rest of the state and or regional economy. We can look at it from 2 different levels of geography. Linkages are really important in terms of economic development. That is, when you have activities that trigger follow-on activities, those are important for economic growth, if the linked activities are in your region or in your state. And similarly, when you have, say, production activities where you have to procure inputs, procuring them from in-state suppliers or in-region suppliers has a beneficial effect on the regional economy as a whole. And when I say beneficial effect, I mean in terms of the increasing jobs and job opportunities, increasing personal income levels, or a state gross product. Let me just go back for 1 second. Well, we can talk about some of those details if we have time in a minute. But so I want to just quickly go over then what the characteristics of the New England food system are and what they are relative to that when we get to New Hampshire. I should say that when we talk about, I mean, one of the things to talk about here in terms of sales very quickly as a general concept is that sales, or also called output, when you see a figure for dollar value of sales, it includes a lot of double counting in the sense that when a manufacturer buys inputs to production, he buys $100 worth of inputs and he sells $150 worth of outputs. The $100 regionally is still there as agricultural outputs, say, and the $150 that he sells in terms of value, which includes the $100, you still get output of $250 for the region as a whole. So when you look at sales and output, it's common to present them, but you have to remember that things aren't quite that big in net terms. The net production of the manufacturer is just the $50 above what they acquire in terms of inputs. So that's an important thing to remember. But we still talk about it that way to give you a sense of the magnitude of dollars involved. Jobs in the food system, jobs are particularly important, but they're poorly measured in the area of agriculture and fisheries. And that's because farm operators are counted in the agricultural statistics as farm operators, but they're not classified according to primary crop or product. And so we don't really have good jobs data over time for detailed agricultural and fishery production activities. We do have hired figures for hired support workers for crops and animal products, but we don't have them in a detailed form, and we don't have the operators. What happens is, particularly for agriculture and fisheries, is there's an undercount of employment levels because family workers who are engaged in production activities on farms are not counted as employees. Their hours are not measured. We don't have a sense of the level of effort, which is an interesting problem because, you know, agricultural statistics were one of the first collected in this country, and they're still not particularly detailed when it comes to looking at economic analysis. They're not very helpful that way. So, yeah, and the same is true for fisheries. That is, there are a lot of individual proprietorships, people who own equipment for fishing, and they don't count family members or other levels of effort that are involved beyond just owning the equipment or being a fishery enterprise. So now we can talk about some of the detail. If you look at the 4 basic industries that we classified the food system as, in the region, food service dominates in terms of jobs. More than half the jobs are in food service. And the thing, the smallest category is an interesting one by itself, is food product manufacturing. It's only 5% of the total. So over half is food service. Product manufacturing is just 5%. Reason why manufacturing is important is it has the deepest linkages with the rest of the economy. It's the one with all the connections to transport, utilities, finance, information services. They are enmeshed in the economy in a very large way. Less so for agriculture, but that's 13% of the state employment, or the regional employment is in agriculture and fisheries, and trade and distribution. So that's warehousing and warehousing activities and transport stuff. Not transport, just warehousing, sorry. So in terms of jobs, food service is very large. In terms of the value of sales, food service is much less important, remembering the double counting thing. Food service is only 20% of the regional sales volume, and trade and distribution takes over, but there's an awful lot of dollars in trade and distribution, again, that has double counting and isn't necessarily a generator of value for the regional economy. And food product manufacturing is actually more important in terms of sales than it is in terms of jobs. For New Hampshire job distribution looks pretty similar to the region as a whole. If you remember that food service value was 56% for the region, and it's 54% for New Hampshire. And trade and distribution, the second one, I think for the region was 26%. And if you get a copy of the slides, you can look at these things and certainly send me questions about any of the information that's presented here. And New Hampshire, even with a minuscule coastline, has agriculture and fisheries that are about the same as the region as a whole. And that's an interesting thing to remember. When you look at the sales or sales value, here we have some difference with between New Hampshire and the region as a whole. Here, fisheries is actually about the same as the region as a whole. It's fairly small in terms of total value. And trade and distribution is a little bit stronger than the region as a whole, if I recall right. No, it's actually about the same. Sorry, let me just, we're right around the same levels for New Hampshire as the New England region as a whole. In addition to those levels, what the most important areas of the food system are in kind of a broad overview, we look at food system growth. And if we look at New England's food system growth, this chart presents both sales in the green and the jobs in blue. Looking at food system growth from 2007 to 2017. Why the weird time periods? Those correspond with the Census of Agriculture. I rely on those because they're the most consistently estimated employment and output numbers, and they only occur in 5-year intervals. So the 2022 numbers are not out yet. They will probably be out late next year or early 2025. But I'm looking at the 2007 to 2017. That's the longest period that I prepared data for. And in preparing data, I had to put things in constant dollars and make sure that everything lines up so you can really compare the two time periods. And when you're looking at growth rates over time periods, the endpoints matter. You can have some very funny numbers show up because of the endpoints you've picked, and then you've estimated the growth rate that occurs in between them. But growth rate is done on a compound annual basis, and all that says is you've taken the growth between the two endpoints and distributed it over time to put it in an annual basis so you get a sense of what it is. For the region as a whole, jobs aren't growing in agriculture. They've declined a little bit in sales. Jobs in food product manufacturing for the region have grown about 1%, but the sales value has declined by about 0.5% per year. The two stronger areas for the region as a whole are in trade and distribution and food service. And you see a growth rate for the New England region of about, I don't know, that's about 6.5%, something like that. Sorry, 0.6%. And you wonder, well, is that a big rate or is that a little rate? And just for reference, the region as a whole is only growing at, I think, 5%, 0.5% per year, 0.5% per year over this time period. So when you have a growth rate of job growth in trade and distribution that's slightly higher than that, that's okay. That's pretty good. When you have a growth rate like the sales value of almost 2% in trade and distribution, that tells you that there's something happening in trade and distribution in the region, which is fairly strong and above the rate of population growth. So that's a more important thing from the economic standpoint. And for food service, again, strong growth rates, higher than the population as a whole. New Hampshire's population during this period, 2007 to 2017, only grew by 0.3% over that period. So when you see these values well above the 0.3%, say, in this chart for New Hampshire's food system growth for food service, that's an important finding again. And the value for trade and distribution is a little bit less prominent than that, but it's still well above what the population growth rate was. Now, obviously, COVID will have changed a lot of these things because New Hampshire's population is now, in the last couple of years, is growing faster than that 0.3% and is now 0.5%. But take a look at the wild numbers on food product manufacturing. You've got a big jump in jobs and a big drop in sales. So a lot of the jobs are people are being engaged in producing lower values of sales output. And despite the fact that there's double counting in there, there are important changes that are occurring below the surface. And they're going to stay there for now, at least in terms of my presentation. So, but
Nick,
that's.
Nick, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I feel like that's a really important point there. Do you think you could give us one example of, whether it's hypothetical or not, of what you just said with the food products manufacturing?
Yeah, let me think real quickly about that. I'm thinking of the major producers that are in New Hampshire. A lot of these things, well, one of the products that is a prominent one we'll see is dairy products. And those products have notably volatile prices. That is, when milk production is up in California and in the upper Midwest, that will result in a drop in sales value. That is, the unit prices of milk drop tremendously. I'm not sure that that's the case in 2017. I suspect it might be. It can change from year to year, and in this case it did. But the job growth can be up. So dairy product manufacturing may engage more people because of some expansion in a couple of the large dairies or fluid milk processors in the state. And that's how you would end up with that kind of shift. But particularly for food products and agriculture both, they're tied to commodity prices. And New Hampshire and even the rest of New England doesn't control hardly any of their commodity prices. They're not big enough to move prices around. In the food products input products of agriculture and fisheries. These are commodities, and they are subject to competition from places all around the country at this point. So let me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, in terms of agricultural production, very quickly, New England is a big producer in terms of, I'm looking at this in terms of sales, because jobs don't mean anything when you get to agricultural and fishery products because of that counting problem. But fisheries produce the greatest value in New England of all the New England agricultural and fishery products, believe it or not. And a lot of it has to do with fisheries in Massachusetts and Maine, particularly. Maine has lobster, Massachusetts has an awful lot of the rest of the ground fish. So those are the biggest category in terms of sales. And the second largest is dairy cattle and milk production. And New Hampshire figures largely in that. That has a good sized piece of it. And the third category, which is important, is greenhouse, nursery, and floriculture production. It's important for in and of itself, but it's also important because it's not really a category that's going to be affected by resilient eating or changes in self-sufficiency in the regional production. I put it in there because it is part of the agricultural statistics that gives you the agricultural total, and it is an agricultural pursuit, even if it's not primarily a food one. It does have some links to food production, which I'll talk about shortly, but the takeaway from this is not to remember that, animal production is 5% of the regional total, and it's 7% in New Hampshire. That's a slight difference. It's really that the industry or the food system for agriculture and fisheries is dominated in terms of value by the fisheries, and that's largely, it's not really a New Hampshire phenomenon. You can see from the fisheries numbers looking at New Hampshire that it's less than half of what the regional total is. And it's not that New Hampshire doesn't want to produce these things, that it has no coastline. It's just an accident of geography. If it had a larger coastline, it would be right up there with Rhode Island or something. But greenhouse and nursery production in New Hampshire is the largest part of the agricultural and fishery sales. And well, I can reveal one of the secrets, so that is, it's really dominated by a large firm, and I happen to, you will recognize these if you've been to your local garden center. Proven Winners is actually owned by, or co-owned by a New Hampshire firm in Loudon, I think. I think it's Pleasant Valley. I forget what the rest of the name is. It's Pleasant Valley something or other, but it's actually not on the container. And the container actually denotes this as DeKalb, Illinois. But it's okay because these are my cilantro seeds and they're grown in New England because I put the seeds in the empty container. So, but that's an important one because Proven Winners, and I think it's Pleasant Valley is the name, has started a hydroponic seedling and actually production business where they're producing a lot of small greenhouse and hydroponically grown vegetable products for consumption. And that's become a high growth area for them. And it may lead to being a high growth area for New England because it's more suited to our climate than other places if we can do it in an energy efficient manner. But it's certainly proven to be profitable for the Dutch. If you think of the big agricultural producers in Europe, the Dutch dominate well above and beyond their physical scale and size. And one of the areas is in high value added agriculture, and that's greenhouse grown food products. And their tomatoes don't taste very good, but everyone buys them anyway, which makes no sense. But so that's the food, agriculture, and fisheries part. New Hampshire does have only one category that's important for resilient eating, and that's vegetable and melon farming. It's otherwise weak in terms of fruit and grains. Those are the areas that will grow with resilient eating. Not critical at this point. And in animal production, apart from dairy, it's not terribly strong. and won't suffer much if there's a shift. So that's a benefit in that sense. But so really, the vegetable and melon category is the big food product of the food products, followed by dairy production and the floriculture greenhouse activity area. In terms of, so that's agricultural products. Very quickly, the food products, the manufactured part, the one that has all the economic impact in terms of job multipliers and output multipliers. Looking at the right-hand pie chart, you'll see that breweries and fluid milk, two liquids, are the big categories, and sugar and confectionery products. And this is an interesting set of results because this shows you how the numbers in a state, it's not a large state, but can be skewed by single firms and their single activities. Fluid milk production, I think there's a classification problem. I could be wrong on this. The biggest producer, I think, was Stonyfield Farms in terms of dairy products, but the Census of Agriculture shows a zero value virtually for other dairy products, which includes the yogurts. And my guess is they somehow got classified as fluid milk producers. It is the single largest activity in New Hampshire. So if you want to think of Vermont as the dairy producing state, you'd be not entirely correct, because New Hampshire is almost their equal. And the breweries number, so if I'm right, in Stonyfield Farms is dominated by or the fluid milk is dominated by Stonyfield Farms. That's owned by Lactalis, which is a French company. And that'll be important for, I'll just tell you in a second. Breweries is owned by Anheuser-Busch. That's the big brewer. There are a lot of craft brewers that are missing in this, even in 2017, because the census didn't count craft brewers in 2017, specifically and very well. So the numbers that you see for breweries here, 26% of the total food products of all food product manufacturing in New Hampshire being breweries, that's the Anheuser-Busch brewery. That's it. They don't employ very many people, but they produce high value. It's kind of like an oil refinery that way.
Nick, I just want to give you I promised I'd give you a 5-minute warning. So this is all so fascinating, but we're gonna, in about 5 minutes, try and pause for some questions.
Good, we'll do it. The other category is sugar and confectionery products. So that's dominated by Lindt. Lindt is a Swiss producer. Lindt delivers and used to deliver chocolate in large blocks by air freight to New Hampshire. And so the inputs, apart from the sugar and the labor, were supplied as a prepared input in Switzerland and delivered to New Hampshire that way. The reason I talk about those three, Lactalis, Anheuser-Busch is owned by AmBev, which is a Belgian company, and sugar and confectionery products. These three industries ought to have good job and output multiplier effects through those linkages I talked about. But the problem is a lot of the linkages for these non-New Hampshire-owned businesses occur elsewhere, because when Lindt wants to do accounting and Lindt wants to do machinery supply and maintenance and design, they do it in Switzerland. They import that stuff to operate their manufacturing facility in New Hampshire. For yogurt, Lactalis does its own accounting and other services to the firm, marketing particularly. They arrange for that stuff outside. Some of it may occur in New Hampshire, but for the most part, it's going to be outside. And the same is true for as for the breweries. So let's see what the industries are that have strong multipliers. This is the regional chart, and we're not going to go over all the numbers, but basically, if you remember, the vegetable and melon or food products, preserved fruit and vegetable products, have moderately low multipliers. These are the multipliers. Let's just say a good size multiplier for output is right around, nationally it's well above 2, but when you talk about regional production for New England, getting a multiplier, say for cheese production at 1.74 is a good size multiplier. For every dollar of output in cheese production, you generate a total in the economy of $1.7. Unfortunately, New Hampshire has no cheese production. The highest multipliers there go to cheese production, which is why Vermont looks so good in the regional economic numbers. And New Hampshire has some of the, well, gotta be blunt here, some of the worst numbers, because your brewery for the Budweiser brewery has a very low output multiplier regionally. And when you look at it within the state, it's even lower than the numbers here. It's even worse than these numbers depict, because again, Anheuser-Busch is a national company and procures services and support outside of New Hampshire in order to operate the dairy in the brewery in New Hampshire. So those are important things to remember. Yeah.
Nick, these are numbers based on 2017, right? Still?
That's correct. Yeah.
And then would you mind, well, first I have to do a little shout out to the New Hampshire Cheese Guild, with just newly relaunched.
Okay.
And to just point out that these are old numbers, and we're really excited about the energy they're bringing to the cheese industry in New Hampshire. And
right.
No, I know. It's and also I had a question that I'm forgetting now. Could you explain the employment, like using one of those as an example, what it means when it says a multiplier for employment? Is it?
Yes, sure. And it's the same thing. For every job you create in cheese production, you will generate a total of 4.3. Just call it 4 jobs outside, including the cheese plant, which is 1 job. You get 3 jobs outside of the cheese plant that are created. And the reason why, of course, is that you create a job in cheese production, they have to acquire milk, which means the dairy farmers have to be producing, and transporters and warehousers and all those jobs that are needed for the supply of milk to make the cheese. And then on the output side, once you've done that, cheese production requires that it also be transported and put into refrigerated storage and packaged and delivered. And that generates a lot of those other 3 jobs. So that's what it is. These job multipliers are, if you can create an additional job in cheese production, I'm not saying you just snap your fingers and they're created, but if you can promote the development of cheese production so you have those jobs, those pay off the best. That's what that means. So why do you think the state of Vermont is actively interested in promoting its cheese products and trying to help the cheese producers support cheese-related travel and tourism and developing branding for these products? This is the reason why, and it pays off. So same with value added. Value add is kind of like the gold standard of economic impact. And that, again, it looks very similar to the employment numbers in this case. For every dollar of value added, so not counting what you buy for inputs, but for the amount of economic activity you create with your labor and with your capital goods, your plants and equipment, that's what the value added number measures. And those are the things that give you economic growth. So anyway.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nick. And I know there's more to share here. Let's take a pause and see what questions folks have.
Okay.
I'm not seeing too many questions yet, so we might just have time to continue. Colleen, have you seen any that you're tracking?
I did see one from Eric. I don't know if this was answered. It's hard for me to tell. Does the food product manufacturing mean raw product production or value added or both?
Food product manufacturing is value added production. So it's for agriculture and fishery products, we measure output at the factory, at the farm gate. And for food products, we measure output of actually inputs that have undergone some kind of processing, some labor value added or some production value added. So yes, it includes all the different kinds of food products that relate to production. I can give you some examples. For grain products, it's flour milling. For other grain products, it's brewing. For vegetables and melon products, the linked manufacturing is usually frozen vegetable production. Sometimes there are some other forms. There are some miscellaneous product manufacturing activities that use all kinds of low level of production for special condiments and sauces and things like that. So it covers the full range of food-related manufacturing, snack foods, and everything else. So are there other, let me see, are there another question on that?
I don't think so. Does anyone, you can.
Yeah, well, I'm just about done here. The last category, of course, was that food, service, and distribution activity. And those are, again, the state as a whole, or the region as a whole, is the biggest part of that is the value of grocery wholesaling output. That's the very specific grocery wholesaling one. New Hampshire is less well represented in that, and which is surprising because it has the number, I looked them up, the number 14 food products distributor in the country, which is C&S, which is a New Hampshire firm. But this happens to be with the actual output that's within the state, and C&S does operate outside of New Hampshire and generates product sales outside of New Hampshire. But so the grocery wholesaling number is relatively small compared to the region. The retailing number is high. It's a good thing because retailing generates more jobs per dollar of output. So that's important. And the other categories are relatively insignificant and will not be really affected by resilient eating or self-sufficiency. The last thing to look at very quickly, when New Hampshire firms produce food system outputs, agriculture, manufacturing, or the trade and distribution and eating places service, the restaurant services, when they sell $1 worth of food system outputs, 75% of those dollars go on to create additional jobs. So you do get a multiplier effect because you keep 75% of the activity that's generated through supplies of things like utilities, transportation, all kinds of related service activities that relate to banking and things like that. Keeping 75% is a pretty good number. You're not losing all that much to outside states. And who does New Hampshire lose it to? Your age-old nemesis here in Massachusetts. That's where the dollars flow, and that's for larger order things like financial and information services and technical services. So those are, other states don't really benefit from New Hampshire outputs all that much. Massachusetts does. And what happens with other states? Well, other states aren't much of a help to New Hampshire because New Hampshire is not selling services and goods to the other food system producers in the region. Again, when you look at what happens for our non-New Hampshire produced outputs, 49% of the jobs that are generated from that, actually it's sales, but for non-New Hampshire food system outputs in the region, half of it goes to Massachusetts, 21% goes to Connecticut. You have to start thinking of financial and insurance services, things like that. 10% goes to Vermont, a state that is smaller in size, but has a more deeply developed agricultural service industry, set of service industries. And New Hampshire gets very little. 2% is as low as it gets. So there is some possibility of developing services, particularly when you start thinking about expanding the floricultural nurseries and vegetable and melon production, and some of the manufactured products that are so strong, being able to export some of the spin-off services from that is where the prospects for growth in New Hampshire are, or appear to be right now. So that's the summary of that. You keep 75%, which is pretty good, keeps it in-house, but it's not benefiting and selling services outside of New Hampshire. So that's an important thing to remember. And we covered a lot of ground, and there's a lot of data in the databases, and it's available to you. It's available publicly. We don't have it set up as a website, but certainly my email is at the very bottom of this slide, and you can send me an email or give me a call. I didn't put my phone number on there, but look us up. It's on the website. Phone number is there, and I'm happy to entertain questions, things that some of them I can answer right away. Some of them it takes me a little time to get to.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Nick. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I forgot
Sorry,
to,
I'm back. Colin, you
I
can.
forgot to tell you, I did find one other New Hampshire food product. So this is the Lindor Lind chocolate ball, and I'm gonna
Perfect way to
celebrate
end.
the end of the talk by eating it.
Thank you for sharing all that so concisely. Does anyone have questions? We're not seeing any.
You probably
There's
wish I was sharing the chocolates with you, but I can't do. It's the one defect of the video presentation.
John Gage had a pretty hefty question. But let's try and tackle it, I think. What kind of state policies promote local food production? And is there any overlap between climate and energy policies with local ag policies? And kind of, I think in relation to that, like, does this classical economics, or do classical economics fail when it comes to the market failure that results in tasteless tomatoes? From Olive.
Well,
Just some easy questions, Nick.
Yeah,
Tackle
just
them.
gonna hit a
those,
few.
those are really good questions. Those are terrific questions. The first one was, read the first part again, just very briefly. That was
Sure. Basically asking
oh, what can states do? It was the policy question.
state policy questions. Yeah.
You know, the state's not going to get engaged in the farming and manufacturing businesses, but it does offer subsidies for certain activities and helps more in the way of business connections and business development services, as well as job assistance services. At a state level, real high level policy tends to be marketing and I'm thinking of Vermont here in terms of branding. I mean, Maine is potatoes, but Vermont has a very active branding program to protect its brands. I remember I brought back a bottle of maple syrup that was packaged actually in Canada, but was sold as Vertmont, Vertmont, and it was sold in France as Green Mountain maple syrup, but it had nothing to do with Vermont. And I sent a picture to the people, the Vermont Department of Agriculture, and they said they'd have their lawyers get right on it. So protecting the brands, creating a brands and protecting the brands are important. Promoting what's different about New England agriculture is an important feature. I mean, we're talking about dairy farms that are directly connected to family farms, and it's a question of scale. It's the biggest drawback economically in the sense that we don't get the economies of scale of running 2,000 head of cattle in a feedlot kind of thing. And we don't have the facilities set up to slaughter that kind of cattle. New Hampshire is weak, like all the other New England states are in terms of animal slaughtering capacity. But if we have resilient eating and we reduce the amount of animal slaughtering, we probably won't be too far off. But I mean, the state of New York gets the benefit of that service. So I think creating a brand and protecting it and identifying the distinctive features of New England agriculture is actually important, because I think they are attractive to a lot of people. Climate change and climate policy, there I think you do have some closer ties in terms of water quality protection and things, if they're going to be actively, the state's actively engaged in promoting water quality and also protecting water quality. Those are important things, but for agriculture, of course, that's a two-edged sword, because that you have agricultural runoff problems that affect waterways and things. And so helping producers minimize their runoff problems, I think would be one of the things the state could do very directly. And since it is public waterways and things that are being protected oftentimes, state funding for that kind of activity would not be untoward, let's put it that way. Tasteless tomatoes. The Dutch have been active in promoting tasteless tomatoes in a very big way. I wouldn't say that there are some protections built into Dutch utility taxation laws, and their failure to tax polluters when it comes to runoff problems. So all the cheese production that the Netherlands has produces a huge byproduct and negative byproduct of nitrogen oxide pollutions and things that run afoul of not only environmental quality laws, but the European community laws. And so they're having to scale back and limit some of their agricultural production in order to meet the environmental quality problems that they've created on their own. But the tasteless tomatoes, I think the market would be well served by simply stopping to buy them. I think that's the tasteless tomato things. The state has promoted some of this with hothouse agriculture and failure to tax emissions accordingly high enough for all the emissions generated for used in hothouse production, which uses natural gas and electricity in great quantities and should be taxed to represent the damage that's caused by those. But they have promoted those, and they've had an active policy of not taxing those heavily enough. And I don't think the correct response is for New Hampshire to turn around and give tax breaks or subsidies to produce, say, for example, greenhouse production of horticultural products or nursery or floriculture products, but to promote solar development and renewable energy uses that can achieve the same result and make it possible to produce those in New England. Whereas formerly we relied on fossil fuels to do any of the greenhouse production. So that's the classical economic view. And that was, I guess, the last question. I'm not sure I'm a classical economist. I recognize probably as well as anyone the externality effects of a lot of these activities, and certainly high energy consumption, manufacturing, and high energy consumption in terms of basic production of agricultural goods, obviously, I think are not adequately reflected in the cost of the goods being sold because they're not being taxed appropriately. But I think unless we have a national policy on that, it's hard for New Hampshire to institute a local carbon tax, for example, that would get the prices of the finished goods up to represent both the value of the good and the damage that's caused to compensate the rest of the state residents for the damage that they cause and don't bear the cost of. So I think that's true for any of the states almost. The only one that can really get away with that is probably California. But a carbon tax ought to be on the table for almost any of the economic activities there are to reflect the damage to climate that's being generated by, production that engages with fossil fuel, heavy reliance on fossil fuels and large relative quantities of fossil fuels, given the value of the goods sold. So that's the long-winded answer.
Thank you so much.
And not the final word, because there are lots of people who will disagree with that, and on oftentimes appropriate grounds. So.
Yeah, I think someone was trying to chime in with a question.
Colleen, it's Eric.
Hi, Eric.
At the beginning, I had asked a question because Nick sort of mentioned change in diet. Could you explain what you meant by that?
Sure. It's a shift in the source of calories. There's a great table that, if you're interested, I can dig up for you, or Nicole might have, or Colleen might have, from the.
Can I want me to explain it, the context, Nick?
Yeah, but it's a shift in diet and source of calories and nutrition.
Eric, the New England Feeding New England report, the regional approach to food system resilience, the premise was what are we eating in New England right now? What are we producing in New England right now? Where do those overlap? And the question about how they might overlap further, the researchers looked both at how might our eating change in New England and how might our production change in New England. And so when Nick was referring to the resilient eating data set, that's the, you can look to the Network Café in I think October, which covered the resilient eating section of the report, which looked at how I eat slightly differently to increase the percentage of food we could consume from our region.
Wrapped up, I want to thank Nick for being here and going through all that data. My head's spinning a little bit, but in the best way possible. I'm putting in the chat a link to our Network Café evaluation. Please fill that out and give us some good feedback. I also want to take a minute to invite you all to our next Network Café, which will be the last volume of this wonderful report, which will really be thinking about market channels, grocery stores, restaurants, institutions, and how those are affecting this kind of whole overarching theme and goal in this report. And with that invitation, I hope you invite folks who may be interested in this topic and may not be here today, but they may be very much interested in that conversation. And we want to continue to grow our network and invite new people in, new voices. So please do that. Thank you so much again for being here, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Friday. And again, thank you to Nick for sharing his expertise with us.